So happy lunchtime, everyone. So welcome to this Lunch and Learn session as part of the FIRNS engagement programme. I'm Helen Avery, I'm Head of Nature Programmes at the Green Finance Institute. At this particular session, we're going to be talking about how to identify and work with landowners and land managers, landholders, in this case, obviously Scottish landholders, as we're looking at FIRNS. So I'm joined today by a wonderful panel who we're going to come to in a moment. So I'm joined by Derek Robeson, Senior Conservation Officer of the Tweed Forum, Eleanor Harris, Natural Capital and Carbon Leader at the Galbraith Group, sorry, I'm trying to get my teeth in today, and Dee Ward, Chair of Wildlife Estates Scotland. We're going to be talking, each of these our panelists is going to be sharing a bit about the work that they've been doing working with landholders across Scotland, and then we'll have a bit of a conversation and open up to Q&A for you to pose your questions to them. So hopefully you'll get a lot out of that. I'm also joined by John Utley, lead on FIRNS at Nature Scot, as you know. So he's going to be just giving us a reminder of the timeline and where we are on FIRNS in a moment. Before that, though, we have a very quick poll because we'd love to know, sort of get a gauge on how many are applying for FIRNS. So if it's okay, if you could just fill in, yes, you are, no, you're not, or C, you are undecided, that would be wonderful. And that will just give us a sense of tracking where we are in the application process. And I think that's it for me. You can obviously upload your questions in the Q&A function. I will keep an eye on the chat as well, because I know some people like to use that. Please add them whenever you want, and I'll pose them at the end or even as we're going along. I don't think there's any other housekeeping other than to mention, again, if you aren't aware of the Investment Readiness Toolkit, or post the link in the chat, that goes into a lot of detail around the considerations of working with landholders in milestone number 2. So you might want to have a look through that as well. What we heard last week, if you were able to come to that webinar with Simon Whiteman at Esme and Dan Hurd of Nature Finance, was that actually identifying your sellers and the landholders you're going to be working with are really key to do upfront. Otherwise, if they're not engaged, that there really is no project. So we're going to learn a lot today, I think, about how to do that initial stage and approach those landholders. So I think with that in mind, also just to mention, this is being recorded. There will be a recording available. Last week's webinar, there's also a recording if you missed that. We'll put the link of where you can see all the recordings as well if you have missed any of the sessions that we've had. I think we're on number 5 now, I'm not entirely sure. And we've still got a couple to go. So with that, I'm going to stop talking. I wonder if we can just see the poll results. That would be helpful. Thank you. Okay, so about yes, no, I'm always interested in people coming who aren't applying, but we're glad you're here all the same, and a few are undecided. Okay, brilliant. Thank you, Phoebe. So with that, I'll hand over to you, John. Thanks.
Thank you, Helen. Welcome everybody this afternoon now to this webinar, and you are all welcome whether you're thinking of applying now to FIRNS or not. You're obviously interested in this topic, which is great because it's so important. I want to say a few words to focus us this morning. But first of all, I just want to remind you of who we're working with here. So Nature Scot are working with the National Lottery Heritage Fund to deliver this programme on behalf of Scottish Government. So we're very excited to be working with Lottery. They bring a lot of expertise. It's great to have the brilliant support of Helen and Phoebe at Green Finance Institute, and also really grateful today to have the support of Derek and Eleanor and Dee. So if you've been to previous webinars, you're probably sick of the sight of me by now, but anyway, you've not got long to suffer, and then we'll get on to our guest speakers. So the purpose here is to boost innovative financing of nature restoration, nature recovery and natural capital growth in Scotland, and I think there are 5 key words just like to pop in to focus minds. I've already said the first one: innovation. We need new ways of doing business. We need new business models, new ways of organizing ourselves. So innovation is key. Integrity. We need projects supported by private investment and markets to deliver real and measurable environmental benefits, genuine contributions to addressing the climate nature crisis. Just transition, that's 2 words, is so important in Scotland. We need to bring people with us, and we need to make sure that everybody benefits from new markets, new sources of investment, land use transformation projects. And revenue. Investment is kind of writ large in this, but actually it's all about revenue. How do we generate new sources of revenue from nature and natural capital? Because if you need investment in capital, you need to be able to pay it off. So you need some kind of revenue. And scale, in brackets, eventually. We need to scale this up to landscape scale, to catchment scale. So we might want to start small, but it has to be scalable and at pace. So those are my five words. We've got a lot of expressions of interest, over 70, so it's a big job, and we're in the middle of trying to review them and give you our feedback over the next couple of weeks. So hopefully you'll hear back from us very soon if you have submitted an expression of interest. And then we'll be looking forward to receiving applications over the next 2 months. All the information that you need is on the FIRNS website, which I think the links will be posted in the chat. Or you can just Google FIRNS NatureScot and it should be the first result on the list. So just remind ourselves of the timeline for a moment. So the deadline for applications is the 16th of June. And that will come pretty quickly. So yeah, not long really to go. And we'll be hoping to announce successful applications towards the end of August. So these webinars have been really great. There's a couple more that GFI are running for us. Next one's on the 16th of May. I'm sure the link will go in the chat for that. It's also on the NatureScot web pages. And that's on baselining and estimating ecosystem services. So that's enough from me. Let's move on to the main business and our speakers for today. So back to Helen.
Thank you, John. It's always wonderful to see your face. So we'll never tire of your introductions. So thanks for being here. John's going to join us at the end on the Q&A, everyone, if you've got questions specifically about the fund as well. So we'll see him in a moment. But first, we'd just love to invite Derek to join us. Derek is with the Tweed Forum and is going to give just a short presentation on some of the work that's taking place at the Tweed Forum before we sort of ask Derek to share his insights on how to work with landholders. Thanks, Derek.
That's great, Helen. Thank you very much, and great to be here. Thank you for asking Tweed Forum along. Just give you 5 minutes introduction into who Tweed Forum are and what we've been doing over the last 30 years or so. Well, Tweed Forum's an environmental charitable trust first and foremost, and we've been working with landowners within and around the Tweed catchment for that length of time, for 30 years. It's very much about working with farmers, getting onto farms, delivering projects at scale, and increasingly at scale. So that's kind of what we do. We try to promote integrated catchment management and ecosystem services as we go forward, increasingly important. So it's about bringing everything together, integrated catchment management. Phoebe, are you able to move that slide forward, please? Yeah, great. So that's the area in which we work. It's 5,000 square kilometres between Edinburgh and the English border. It's an unusual catchment because it's partly in England. It's about 14% in England and 86% in Scotland. So it's a big catchment. But that's our office, if you like. Next slide, please. And we don't do it in isolation. We very much work in partnership. We have about 30 members of our organisation that meet regularly. And the key ones are the farmers and the landowners, obviously, but then we work with government departments, work with private and voluntary sector, work with local authorities. And between them, we get projects done. That's how we seek out the funding, we seek out the interest. That's what it's all about for us in delivering on the ground. Next slide, please. Just a very quick summary of our achievements. We've planted about 1.4 million trees in a landscape scale situation. We've fenced off 300 miles of river. We've controlled hogweed and knotweed right across the catchment. We've got that almost completely under control. We've got about 5,000 hectares of peatlands restored and lots of ponds and wetlands. So it's very much about habitat management at scale. Next slide, please. What we've learned from these years, I think, is working with farmers and landowners is from a project inception is when you've got a good idea and you've got some funding behind you, get the farmers on board very, very quickly. Get farmers and landowners on board right at the beginning and try and get them together very early on with your ideas and your suggestions. And once you've got them together and once you've got them interested, engage with them all the time, keep them engaged, keep them informed. It's really important, absolutely at the very fundamental stage, to get the landowners on board with your ideas and your projects so they can ultimately take the lead in them, and because they'll be the ones that will deliver them on the ground. And historically, what we've tried to do is historically make projects, capital-based projects, cost neutral to the farmers and the landowners, but increasingly we're finding going forward that probably just isn't enough. We need to get them to cost neutral, but you almost have to get an income going forward. So the green finance packages we're talking about today, these become increasingly important as time goes on. I'll just give you one or two examples if I can. Next slide, please. Yes, here's a woodland one, for example. Now, here's a map of the borders, and it's in colour for the most part, but these green areas, these green blobs you can see there are areas of woodland that have been planted, and on the right-hand side, these are the subcatchments. There's about 9 subcatchment there. And in these catchments, the driver is very much natural flood management above towns. And what we try to do is get farmers within these subcatchments together right away if we've got some funding. We try and get them together and we call them to meetings, and we tell them what the project is and we get them engaged. And if we can get these woodlands between the Scottish Forestry Grant Scheme and the actual cost of doing it, if we can bridge that gap, increasingly we'll try to bridge it through carbon financing, carbon funding, carbon credits. But historically, we've got it from wind farm funding and other sources like that. So it's about bridging that gap between the cost and the actual grants, etc. This facilitation, really. Next slide, please. Here's an example of a riparian woodland, and all the benefits are listed down the side. I won't go through them all, but that's a typical riparian woodland, and that has to work at scale, clearly, because you want to link one farm that you're seeing there with the farm below that one and the farm above that one. It's all about habitat connectivity and all the benefits that accrue downstream from there. Next slide, please. So what we do is we tend to take the forestry grant scheme and any other monies we can get, like the wind farm biodiversity offsets, increasingly carbon funding, as was mentioned, but what we're finding is there's about a 30% gap between the grant and the cost. And so we're encouraging farmers to buy into these woodland carbon credits, currently worth about £2,700 a hectare. Increasingly, we're finding that landowners are holding on to these credits. They're registering them, holding on to them because the market's increasing, it's expanding, it's going up. So the value of these credits are increasing all the time. So there's a slight problem there that, as the markets are developing and go up, people are holding on to their credits. They're not wanting to sell because the market is going up. So there is still an issue with these, but hopefully that will iron itself out in time. Next slide, please. The same can happen with peatlands. The peatland on the left is an eroded peatland. Peatland on the right, you can get carbon credits for them as well. Depends on the condition of the moorland at inception. Depends on how much you're doing for restoration. But once it's done, you can see the economic benefits of doing that. You can see the biodiversity benefits of doing that, the climate change benefits, the carbon storage benefits. So that, again, that market for peatland carbon will develop as time goes on, as well as forest carbon. Next slide, please. And the last one I want to talk about is just the Edelston Water Project. This is a 10-year project, multi-partnership project, lots and lots of different landowners in this catchment, all working together upstream and downstream. And what the partners set out to do was test whether farmers are interested in doing natural flood management, but also seeing whether it's cost effective to do it within a farm business. And can you value them? Next slide, please. And what you're seeing here is that the monitors of this project have actually found that the measures that have been put in place, like woodlands and leaky barriers and ponds and wetlands, that's prevented flood damage of up to £1 million already. But you could increase that across the catchment if there was farmer interest, up to maybe £3 million net present value, if you were to do it the right amount at the right scale across the catchment. Next slide, please. They've also looked at the ecosystem service benefits. They are listed in the white box. But for the work that's been done already, they reckon there's ecosystem service value of £4 million on the work that's already been done, but that could be scaled up to £16 million if it was done at scale across the catchment. So it's just getting the farmers to buy into that idea and that thought process, and then finding a market. We've got the forest carbon market, we've got the peatland carbon market, but you need to get the biodiversity market going. and looking at biodiversity credits and things like that. So that's probably the argument and discussion will go next. Next slide, please. And who's missing from this conversation? Well, it's investors, because not enough public money in the system. Flood insurance companies, downstream impacted residents, fisheries, recreational businesses, tourism businesses, people are really benefiting from all this work that's going on. We need to bring them to the table and get them to invest in this kind of work. Next slide, please. This is the last one. So I think it's a good summary slide. It helps us link the upstream and downstream. It's the users with the providers of these services. And for us, very much the future lies in the uplands. That's where the green financial markets will develop most rapidly going forward, we feel. I'll leave it at that. That's okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Derek. Those slides are fantastic. Thank you so much. And particularly I liked the list of all the benefits that have been identified. Obviously, only some of them we've figured out ways of turning those into, well, finding someone to pay for them. And then the NFM data was really interesting. So you mentioned there the opportunity for natural flood management, carbon, woodland and peatland, and then future opportunities for biodiversity. I suppose the first question is, well, I've got a few here, but one, as you were just talking there, I was sort of interested, when you're talking to landholders and the farmers, what are, it's a bit random, but what are the sort of typical questions they're asking you? What is it that they're concerned about that you might have to sort of be prepared to?
Yeah, I think when you've got a good project and a good idea, clearly they're looking for facilitation. They're looking for someone like Tweed Forum to take on the paperwork, to take on the negotiation with contractors, to take on that kind of side of paperwork for claims, etc. as well. And they're looking for just a steer and a lead and somebody to take it, because they're busy people. So that's where Tweed Forum can come in and you know, find the funding packages, liaise with all the partners that need to be liaised with, all the government agencies that need to be consulted when any work's been done. We can take all that and we can lead them all through that process and help them with that. So we can reassure them that will be a relatively painless process for them. And we've got 30 years experience behind us that can show them that we are credible and we can deliver projects on the ground. So it's just reassuring them, but keeping them on board. And yeah, they're just about facilitation and taking them with you. Yeah.
And of the markets that you mentioned, have you sort of seen, you mentioned that increasingly more are looking to sort of receive an income and therefore looking to green finance opportunities and these nature markets. Were there any that they feel more comfortable with at the moment, and sort of more familiar with woodland carbon, perhaps?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's woodland carbon. It's fairly well established now, and that's fairly popular and understandable. People get their heads around that one. Although we mentioned briefly there that people are registering their woodlands, but not necessarily selling their carbon credits. So because the market's rising, so you can understand that. But if they don't sell their credits, then how do you find the shortfall funding to make these work? So you could part sell. You could sell half of the credits, make the project work financially, and still retain half the credit. So you can do it that way, or part of the credit, do it that way, or you can find other sources. Same with peatlands. Peatlands is up and coming. They're working on that one at the moment. It's gathering pace through SNH, Nature's got rather. But then the other ones we talk about, the biodiversity credit market, that is there or thereabouts, but it'll take time. It will take time. But think once they crack that one and they get a lot of investment, private investment into that angle, then that's when things will really start to take off, we feel. So there's a wee bit to go there, and there's lots of people looking at it, but I think not to be put off by it. I think it will come. It will come good. I think a lot of hesitation. So I think a lot of hesitation at the moment is just with the subsidy system too. The subsidy system in Scotland is not terribly clear at the moment. There's an outline of which way it'll go, but once that is settled and clearer, people will be more confident to invest because they'll have a direction to travel from the government support, and then they'll see where they can go with the private funding as well. So I think there'll be a much more stable base for people to then look to the future with some long-term confidence.
Yeah, and probably not a bad idea then to baseline now. Yeah, and wait to see how, you know, a couple of things play out, and so sell half, as you say, and keep half. That's a good idea. And just finally, and the question has completely skipped my mind. Well, I have some here, so I'll just ask you this one. In terms of building credibility in the space, that was it. It was going to be: are they selling individually, or are they selling as an aggregated model? The credits, do you think? What's their sort of preference?
They're selling individually. usually. So that's how they're doing it. Each of these contracts are with the individual through a broker, like Forest Carbon, for example. So they say, "Oh,
Right.
that agreement with Forest Carbon, for example," and then it's up to the farmer what he does with it. So yeah, so that tends to be how they do it. Yeah, individually.
Brilliant. Okay. Thank you, Derek. I have so many more questions for you, but I think we'll move on and we can always come back to them as well, because I'm sure those listening have got questions too. But thank you. It was a wonderful presentation, and we've had comments in the chat echoing that. So Eleanor, over to you now. Thank you so much for joining us. Before I say we'll get into some questions, I have a few here for you because of all the great work that you've been doing with farmers. But just sort of over to you if you want to give a presentation, an overview of some of the work that you're doing. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go through the multiple steps required to share my PowerPoint, which is always slightly traumatic. Hopefully you can see my screen in the correct view, and this gives me timings as well. So give me a shout if it's not animating properly. But thank you very much for having me. And my brief was to talk about farmers. So I've called this Scottish Farmers and How to Find Them, because it can sometimes seem a bit difficult. If there are any farmers watching this, I hope this amuses you, and I'd love to hear your feedback later on my overview. So I'm the natural capital leader at Galbraith. We're a firm of chartered surveyors. We have a significant rural team working with farmers, about 50 people across Scotland, also in the north of England. We're a partnership, which means we're owned and run by people working in the firm, based here in Scotland, so that we're really rooted in Scotland, and many of our rural agents are also from farming backgrounds. They have family farms. They're really a part of the scenery. So got probably too much information, but we can share the slides later on and you can digest it a bit more leisure. Who are farmers in Scotland? It's about 1 in 40 people in Scotland in the workforce are employed in agriculture. They tend to be on the older side. This is the farmers themselves. If you think of CEOs, they might tend to be older as well. There's lots of other people working in farming who are also younger. Some farmers own the land they farm on, some rent it, that they often rent to each other. It's not just the case that there are big estates with tenants, there are those, but there's also a lot of land letting going on. So the person that's farming the land might not be the person that owns it, and it would be difficult to make a generalization about what that's going to look like. That's something you want to bear in mind when you're looking at land use. What kind of thing are they doing? Well, this is land use in Scotland, farming in Scotland by area. A little bit of it looks like this. Quite a lot of it looks like this, which is basically massive lawn mowers. A lot of Scotland grows grass as an intensive crop for feeding animals, and a huge amount of it looks something like this. Permanent grazing, less favoured area farming. What are they producing? I'm going through this very fast for reasons that will become apparent, but lots of beef and milk, quite a lot of cereal, quite a lot of fruit, and then various other things. And in terms of the farm businesses, this is a handy little infographic with income on the left and costs on the right. You can see that the whole thing is kept in the black, partly by subsidies. So if government subsidies were to reduce, that could be a significant threat to the profitability of farming. It's also kept in the black by things that aren't farming, other things going on, holiday lets, renewable energy, and natural capital. So if you can grow that bit, that could be an opportunity. But don't miss this bit. A lot of our work with farmers at the moment is on reducing the significant cost of inputs, things like feed and fuel, fertilizer. These all have carbon footprints, so decarbonisation of Scottish agriculture and the increasing profitability of Scottish agriculture go quite closely together. And don't miss this bit. Farms are basically producing stuff, and if they can produce more stuff in a sustainable way, then again, that makes them more profitable businesses. So natural capital is one part of this really important overall picture. I want to focus on less favoured areas. So this is a UK designation for essentially bits of the country that need a bit more subsidy support because they're marginal for farming. And as you can see, this is a very large proportion of Scotland is less favoured areas. That graph I showed earlier of output, a lot of the output comes from those pale bits around the East Coast. But actually, if you're developing a natural capital project, chances are it's going to be in the peatland or in the woodland creation areas or the water catchment areas that are in these less favoured areas. And in these areas, all the statistics are more extreme, less output, more subsidy required. So, but something that's perhaps counterintuitive is that in these areas such as the Highlands, where farming is more marginal, less profitable, it's actually a more important part of the economy, because in those eastern areas, in the Lothians, for example, farming might be quite good, but the rest of the economy is enormous. There's all kinds of things going on. Whereas in the Highlands, farming might be very marginal, but it's also 10% of the workforce. It's a huge part of that economy. So it suddenly becomes very important. I was trying to tot up the various different types of government support for less favoured areas. And I reckon it's probably in the region of £1 billion a year. So a lot of money goes into these areas. Is that going to be there in 10 years' time? If it isn't, where are these areas? What's going to be happening here? In 2017, which is the latest figures I could find, the average rent paid was £27 a hectare. Well, if you imagine a carbon scheme yielding 4 tonnes of carbon at £40 a tonne per year, suddenly farming starts to look rather uncompetitive compared to natural capital. And I also want to mention crofts. Could do a whole presentation on crofts. There's about 20,000 of them covering all that area. And some key features of crofts is they've got a small cultivated area, a very extensive shared common grazing area, and they're not designed to be a full-time job. They're designed to be supplemented by other income. So everything about crofts, some are owner occupied, some are rented, everything about them confounds statistics and categorization. So you'll have to, if you've got crofts in the area, have to go and look into them in a bit more depth. How do, nearly at the end here, how do farmers see themselves? Here are a few posts on social media by some farmers in these less favoured areas who do good social media accounts. You'll hear them talk about themselves as food producers, of course, that's really important, as stewards of the land, as the heart of the community, and as businesses. And all those, yes, I think are really important aspects of what these farmers are. In many ways, they're the only people doing that thing in many of these areas. In many ways, we could also critique a lot of what is being done by the way they're doing this, and could say they could probably do them much better. But are all these really how they see themselves, or is how they think that they want to be seen? Is this them fitting in? And actually, my observation is really many of these farms, what makes them tick is the animals. That really a lot of the identity of a less favoured area farmer is about working with animals, with the cattle, with the dogs, with the sheep, and that suddenly changes the discourse about, well, you could make a lot more money by planting trees. Well, I could make a lot more money by planting trees, but that's not what I'm about. So I don't want to sort of labour this point. The point I really want to make is you need to you need to go and talk to them and find out what makes them tick, and how to get them involved in what you're interested in doing. And finally, so how do you do it? Where do you find them? Farmers generally would rather be outdoors than in a meeting in a room. And I don't think I've ever managed to get a farmer on a Teams call, so congratulations if you're one here today. In my experience, you have to go and find them where they are, and that is generally, and they do get together quite a lot, they're very gregarious. Farmers get together at shows, come to the Royal Highland Show, and we will introduce you to some, but lots of regional shows, also events, workshops, local NFU events, all that kind of thing. And we, coming back to Galbraith ourselves, we're farm agents. If we're gatekeepers, we're doing our job wrong. Rural agents are sometimes sort of seen as blocks in the system. That's not what we're here for. We're supposed to be door openers. And we can talk about carbon and natural capital projects and business planning and regional land use partnerships and all those big long words. And we can also go and talk to farmers and in their language and people who from farms. I think what my role is very much trying to oil the wheels of project development. So do come and chat to us afterwards if this is something we can help with to help you work up your ideas, get through the technical language, think through what might work in a place, and start conversations with farmers with valuable conversations rather than barriers going up. That is, how do I stop screen sharing? That's my presentation, so it is a little over the 5 minutes, but happy to answer questions.
It was wonderful. Yeah, Eleanor, that was really great. Some really, again, just some amazing slides and so much information. Thank you. And some great tips there of sort of being cognizant of the identity of farmers may not be the identity that you go in there with your assumptions of. If there are any farmers here, we'd love to just know you're here in the chat.
Yes, please do. Just say I'm not from a farming background at all. I'm a city girl from Edinburgh, so I've come into this world from the outside and trying to be a bridge.
Well, you sound like an expert to me. So just a couple of questions then around the natural capital. You mentioned, you kind of showed that it's a really big opportunity given the funding and financing situation of the majority of farmers in Scotland. Are you seeing a sort of growing interest from those that you're working with, a bit like Derek sort of shared that he's noticing? And if so, again, is it, you mentioned sort of the conflicts of the woodland versus, having land for animals. What is it you're sort of interested in?
Definitely interest, and definitely, plenty of farmers thinking, well, I've got several hundred hectares of hill. Some of it is valuable for sheep, but actually I could also stick a woodland there and produce carbon credits, produce timber, tick all my environmental boxes, and they could join up together. So that kind of integrated farm forestry, farmers are already starting to do it. All gets more complicated if you've got tenancies involved. And then there are other farmers who either might not have the space to do something, or there's been a lot of concern. There's been a huge amount of chat. I think there has been right through the whole world. There's been a lot of discussion about what does this new natural capital economy mean, and the number of conversations everyone's been trying to get their heads around. Is this going to take away from food production? Is this just, are we just greenwashing the oil industry? What's the long-term sustainability of these land use changes? We've all been trying to work that out. Farmers and rural agents and lawyers and people are still having those conversations. So when you come along to start developing a project, you're dropping into the middle of that, and you'll find some people saying over my dead body, but it might turn out that over their dead body is something that you're not actually proposing. It's something they've heard from somewhere else. So it's what is a natural capital opportunity? And that the statistic I showed about rents versus natural capital opportunities, that has, there's been several examples of landscape being restructured and land use changed, and farming, the fact is that less favoured area farming is marginal, and is there too much of it? But then if it wasn't there, what would be the heart of the rural community? So it's a difficult transition, and it should be able to work well, but it's really all about people, not about trees.
Yeah, totally. I know that Trees for Life often says, repeopling, not rewilding, and it's when they're referring to their project, as you say, it is all about the community and those who are working on the land. I'm going to move on now, but we do have some more questions. I just wanted to flag up that Rebecca has posted that she's a new entrant farmer in the Pentlands. So thanks, Rebecca, for letting us know that there is a farmer here. And please do put your questions to our panel of experts. Ask them for all their tips where you can. But now moving on to you, Dee. Thanks so much for your being patiently waiting in the wings. So we'd love to hear more from you about Wildlife Estates Scotland, its mission, and then we'll come to you again with some questions, because there are things you're doing on your own land as well that could also really be helpful for others to hear about. So over to you.
Thank you. Phoebe, I think you've got, well done. There we go. Right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for asking me along today. I've only got 5 minutes or so to talk, so I'm going to race through these slides and hopefully just stimulate plenty of questions. So feel free to ask me questions at the end. My name's Dee Ward. I'm chair of Wildlife Estates Scotland, but I'm also owner of Rottle Estate, which is in the Angus Glens. And just to give you a bit of detail about that, it's an 8,000 acre upland estate, which we try and focus on holistic and sustainable management, wildlife and biodiversity. We do farm sheep and cattle, but in low intensity. We also have things like events, renewables. We produce hydroelectric power. We have biomass for all our properties and so on. Shooting and stalking does continue on the estate, but it's what we like to call sustainable. We don't release any birds, and it's all about wild shooting and enjoying being in nature and all the rest of it. But we've planted about 250,000 trees over the last 15 years. We've embarked on quite a big program of peatland restoration, of which we've done phase 1, but we've got a number of phases dropping in the next few years. We've done some river improvements, re-meandering the Rottle Burn, which some of you river enthusiasts will know about, and we've just got into a nature restoration fund project with some of our neighbours. So that's sort of a bit of background on us. Next slide, please. So Wildlife Estates Scotland, for those of you who don't know about it, is a European-wide label. In Scotland, there are 60 estates accredited, which totals about 1.3 million acres, and there's a further 300,000 acres in the pipeline. These owners are particularly, I would say, a good target audience. They are very engaged as owners. They're very focused on biodiversity, nature-based solutions. It's an independently audited label, so they have to be they have to produce a huge amount of data on terms of their wildlife and biodiversity. They have an, excuse the dog in the background. They have an excellent existing relationship with Nature Scot, which is good, and they're used to working at scale and collaborating with neighbours and NGOs. So, as I say, that they are a good group of people to target. The current focus is very much on natural capital, carbon, net biodiversity gain, etc. So next slide, please. So really getting inside the mindset of a landowner or land manager, I think it's important to understand that people own estates for a long time. There's obviously different views on whether that's a good or a bad thing, but they tend to have very long plans. If you plant a tree today, your grandchildren will appreciate it in 100 years' time. So I think the mindset is very multi-generational, and that is how their business plans often work. But as such, they're very cautious in actually getting stuck into something new. They often have a wait and see attitude and wait. What they say that the first people in, and normally ones who or whatever, the first people in fall down normally. So they normally wait and come in. So that it's important to understand that. So I think peatland and natural capital falls into that bracket. there's a bit of uncertainty about where that market's going, and I think naturally, though they are enthusiastic to be involved, there is that natural tendency to hold back a bit. They usually have a very strong environmental focus, and I think that's important to realize. The key barriers to entry for them, I would say, are often nature-based projects. There's a large capital cost up front to do it, and obviously there are grants available, but I think this is where the private sector come in. There is uncertainty about the market, especially for things like nature-based solutions. I mean, there is a market for carbon, for woodland carbon and for peatland carbon, but it is still it's still a nascent market, and I think it's very important that it's regulated so people understand what they're getting into. There is also this potential of long-term liabilities. If you're selling 100 years worth of carbon sequestration or carbon storage in your peatland, there is potential liabilities in the future. So people are nervous about that. And I think that what landowners would look for is long-term income streams to guarantee incomes for the future. So if you are changing your operation and maybe being less intensive on your farming, you need to know that that income stream is going to be there for the foreseeable future. So I think this is an important factor. And I think there is an uncertainty with landowners on how to engage with partners, with ENGOs, communities, other landowners, local authorities, even the national parks. I mean, we're in a national park here. So these are sort of areas that I think it's important to understand who you're dealing with and what their concerns might be. Final slide, please. Next slide, please. So what's needed now, in my opinion, I think we really need to break down private and public barriers. More general engagement is required. I've developed good relationships with NGOs over the years, and I've realized that there's a lot in common. There's more that unites us than divides us, and I think often people don't appreciate that. Partnerships, I think, need to look at ESG, private partnerships look at ESG biodiversity outcomes, not just carbon. This all has to work together. If we're delivering for biodiversity and nature, we will also be we'll also be capturing carbon, but it has to go together. And I think we need to avoid that greenwashing that Eleanor was speaking about earlier. Help with developing projects, I think, is really important, and viable natural capital business models that have longevity and work. And I think landowners want to understand what the model is, and be very tangible so they can get their head around it, and also help with developing that model, because it's a new world for us all. And so understanding that is really important. Long-term income streams I've mentioned before, as well as capital costs, I think it's really important that this will ensure successful long-term delivery on projects. And I think that's what we all want. And understanding what ecosystem services can be provided on their land. So what in my specific case, in my upland estate, can I deliver? And I think how can I deliver it? And I think help with that's really, really important. And a defined tangible market for ecosystem services, things like flood management, that is regulated, it's understandable and delivers reasonable returns. I mean, I don't think anyone's here to try and make a fast buck, but I think landowners want a reasonable return on the work they're putting in, because they will be looking after and managing this for 50 years, or their antecedents or whatever will be looking after this for many years to come. I think all groups need to work together to enable delivery on a landscape scale. I think landscape scale is absolutely fundamental. And we all have, what I realize when I speak as a land manager, when I speak to NGOs, we all have a common goal. We all actually want to hit the same things. We all want to save the planet. So we're talking to, we're pushing against an open door, but I think we just need to engage more. And I think catchment scale projects are going to be really important, that protect ecosystems from source to sea. I think it's crazy me doing work in the uplands when someone 3 miles below me is polluting the river, for example. It just doesn't make any sense. So collaboration and partnerships are going to be vital between landowners, ENGOs, private finance, communities, etc. And finally, I think we need a long-term strategy to deliver for nature, biodiversity, climate change, but balanced alongside sustainable food production and well-being for the local communities. So in a nutshell, that's me. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Dee. And again, really, really great slides, really captures exactly what the challenges are for estate owners, large landowners. So I feel like we've had a really good balance of understanding different types of landholders today, and some good tips for approaching them. Dee, just one question before we open it up. I'm not seeing many questions come in. Please do put your questions in, put down your sandwiches and type a question while we have our experts here. So you mentioned that there are certain characteristics of large landowners, estate owners, perhaps greater caution. What do you, I mean, and you talked about partnerships a lot. Typically, we see normally an estate owner embarking on a project itself, rather being approached to be part of a consortium or a collective. Is that your experience? And if you are a project developer looking to engage in an estate, what's the best? I mean, what are your tips for doing that?
I think typically owners have been bad at just wanting to work alone and not in collaboration. But I think the catchment or landscape scale as a start, and catchment scale, would be the ideal, is the way to go. And I think one needs to, because not every estate can deliver the same public benefits or goods. So an upland estate might be able to do peatland restoration, for example. A different estate might be able to deliver some other goods. So I think working together, where one estate might be able to deliver more of X and another might be able to deliver more of Y, where they're neighbouring, could work together. And also that would dovetail their different plans, because one might say, well, look, I don't want to have tons of trees, but I really want to manage the moorland well and restore all the peatland. And another might say, I want to plant lots of trees. So that actually they could work together to create a sort of balanced situation. And I think from a private finance point of view, it makes more sense that the number is bigger, because it kind of makes more sense for them than handing out lots of small amounts, that hand out one big amount for a project. But we're doing a project here with our Nature Restoration Fund, for example, and it's not private finance, I hasten to add, but we're working with the RSPB, Angus Council, the Cairngorm National Park, and private landowners. So we're all kind of get together. And the great thing is that everyone brings their own skills to the party, and that helps the thing run quite smoothly, I would say.
Yeah, and maybe a project to take to FIRNS.
Yeah.
And actually, just listening to you, it just felt like this is just the perfect time for the investment ready fund FIRNS to sort of work through some of these challenges, because I know it's been mentioned before, but there'll be a community of practice that supports those successful grantees, and also some of those sharings will be shared outwards to help sort of unknot some of these knots, as it were. There's a question here in the chat. It's from Adrian. Adrian, I'm going to just ruin your last name, so I won't say it. It's from Adrian. Very helpful, thanks. What interest is the panel seeing from councils, Scottish Water, insurance companies regarding paying for flood and water quality benefits? Has any private investment been secured for water benefits that you've seen?
Are you asking that to me?
It's all of you. So Dee, if you have an answer, then we'll come to Derek, because he talked about NFM
yes,
earlier.
I mean, it's a really good question, and I think one of the points I was trying to make is I don't believe yet, and other panel members might disagree, but there isn't. We're talking about doing these ecosystem services, nature-based solutions, but there isn't what we need to understand is, look, you are, I don't know, holding X amount of water on your hill, and that is worth Y. And I think that we're not we're not there yet, in my opinion. I might be wrong, but that's not my experience. And I think that's where we need to get to, because I think as soon as there's a value on it, people go, oh, that's good. I can store X amount of water in my hill because I planted all these trees or whatever, or restore all this peatland, and that's worth X to the water company or whoever down the road, or the local council, because the local town won't get flooded or whatever. So I think it's really important, but I don't think we're there yet. But they are definitely talking about it now, which is a good thing.
Thanks, Dee. You also see John's got his hand up. Derek, just to come to you first.
Yeah, I could add just to Dee's comments there. I think I'd agree entirely with what he's saying. I think Scottish Water's mentioned there. I think Scottish Water are coming around to this idea. Insurance companies are slower to come around to the idea, but I think it's absolutely essential we do bring them to the table. The councils, well, we can speak for Scottish Borders Council, they're very keen on this kind of thing. But again, when they're looking at flood schemes, flood mitigation schemes, it tends to be capital investment and flood defences. And if they could part company with some of that cash to look at soft engineering at the headwaters of the catchment, so to put in soft engineering like woodlands and wetlands and ponds and leaky barriers, etc., to take a proportion of that budget to help slow the flow down, so that the amount of hard engineering that you need in the towns and cities wouldn't be required quite as much. So they're coming around to that idea, but looking for the evidence base, and that's what the Eddleston Water Project's about in that sense. It's by gathering that evidence base to show, look, these things do actually work. They can take the peak flow off. They do slow the flow of water down. So it's getting that evidence base, but they're heading in the right direction, and they're getting there slowly.
There's still NFM, not water quality, that we've seen.
Yeah, sorry, I'm talking about NFM, water quality. Yeah, sorry, water quality. Sorry, I beg your pardon. Yeah, that's water quantity. I'm talking about mostly water quality.
No, and that's what I asked you about.
Yeah,
but I know Adrian also
sorry.
asked on water quality. So I just
yes.
wondered. I haven't seen any examples in Scotland. Perhaps John will.
Not so much. Not so much for water quality. I don't think. No.
Okay. Thank you. So it looks like there is work happening on NFM. John, and then I'll come to you, Eleanor.
So the answer to your question, Adrian, is that it's coming pretty slowly, but it will come. There's a well-known project in England around the Wyre catchment in the northwest, which is I think got some investment from the reinsurance industry, which is perhaps the most likely source of investment for flood, because obviously there are many insurance companies and they have very kind of dispersed customer bases, especially in rural areas. So it is coming. The other thing I would mention is that there's work going on through hydronation to develop a water metric, which is going to look at flood management, natural flood management, and water quality. So one thing we obviously need to do with these things is measure impacts. So that will be important. And also the British Standards Institute have just started on a whole stream of work for DEFRA around standards for natural capital markets. And one area they will be looking at is natural flood management. So we're starting to get some of the kind of architecture in place to support markets.
Thanks, John. We've posted a case study on the Wyre in case you haven't seen it. On the Investment Readiness Toolkit, there are some examples of projects happening in England around water quality. And I know that there were several NERF projects around NFM, some working with insurers. And I gather one hill, something in Wood, I'll try and remember it in a moment. They actually have had quite some success on a model in England, and we're actually at GFI we're launching an NFM group to kind of work through some of these barriers in a few weeks. Eleanor, was there anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, it was. We hear a lot about water, and I think, well, I don't want to add to what the others have said. This is going to be increasingly important, I'm sure. But the biggest, perhaps the biggest thing happening in the private market that I'm seeing at the moment is in supply chains. And I think this is something that should be in people's thinking, designing catchment projects. We're seeing the dairy industry where you'll have a lot of farms all selling to one big milk buyer. The milk buyers are starting to come together and to design their own schemes to deliver various things on the farm. It might be carbon improvement, it might be water quality, it might be animal welfare. There's an interesting lens project in Ayrshire with Nestle. And another industry that's really important in Scottish agriculture is the whisky industry, which uses most of very large, about half our arable production of our cereal production, and they're also looking very seriously at how they influence their whole supply chain down to the land. So where you've got those low down in the catchment, highly productive farms, the supply chain is starting to be a really big player in starting to transform those. So if you're designing a catchment project, for example, you might be working with people like Dee up at the top of the catchment, looking at peatland restoration. He might be saying, what about, 3 miles down the road there, polluting it? Well, actually, there might be somebody in the supply chain that you could go and talk to about that, who might be already starting to think along these lines. So that just another important factor in farm economics at the moment.
Yeah, there's a lot of things to juggle, aren't there, as a landowner, where things are coming down. I know we're almost at time, but John's also just put in the chat. LENS is Landscape Enterprise Networks. There are a couple of them. No, don't worry. We love acronyms. And I think we've got also some examples of that in our Farming and Finance Report appendix that we've recently launched. There's a lot of case studies specifically around sort of farm aggregation models, of which LENS is one, slightly different because it's set up by the private sector rather than being set up typically by farmers or landowners, as most aggregation models are. Okay, Adrian, we're going to give you the last one, and then I'm afraid we're going to have to call it time. But thank you, all these late questions coming in. And it just says, Eleanor made the point about farmer identity and challenge between food and saving the planet. Are any Scottish landowners talking about scaling up agroforestry, silver pasture systems, sheep with fruit and nuts and berries, potentially more attractive for some investors, and also gets to that point of selling half, maybe you can put some trees in and sell some of it and keep the rest. So just a really quick comment from anyone of the panel. Please wave a hand at me if you've seen, Eleanor, while you're here, please go for it.
We want them to be doing this, and it's really hard because farmers want to keep farming. They don't want to faff about with trees, and foresters want to grow timber. They don't want to faff about with animals, and actually to get them into the same room. And I think this is why I think we need things like FIRNS. We need project developers. We need new players in this game too, because we can see that we need food production. We need food production to be done in this better way. But if you try and do a carbon scheme, you'll get a much more higher yield of carbon if you just get rid of all the farming and do carbon. And if you want to do farming, so that developing those complex models kind of needs to be done, but we're going to need a lot of investment to bring people into a room to say, let's just put all your past behind you. Let's look at what could we do if we had 100 years where we didn't have to worry about making an income and we could just play around, what would it look like? And it needs done, but that's not going to be simple in any way, because if people are doing one thing, don't really, they want to keep doing that, and it's out of everybody's comfort zone.
And Derek, I saw you came off mute. So any sort of final thoughts on that question?
Yeah, I think echo what Eleanor says there. I think we've seen it in the borders here that people are keen to talk about agroforestry and wood pasture, but the Scottish Forestry Grant Scheme doesn't really encourage it at the moment. I know they're working on it with a new subsidy system, so hopefully we'll come up with a better scheme, a better thought through scheme, a better resource scheme. So I think it'll come. We'd like to see it there. I think people would go for it. Very much about integrating land use, integrating farming, forestry, conservation. That's our key mantra here, is integrate it. Try and get it all working together to deliver these services that society needs. And there isn't enough public money in the system, so private investment is essential. But it's very much about integration. Linking upstream and downstream, that's the secret here, I think, definitely.
Thank you. And Dee, any closing words on this topic or any others?
Yeah, I think that we've got where we are by public money being used to get us to drain hills or rip out hedges, etc. And it can't be understated how important money is to direct behaviour change. And I think that we're trying to do the silver pasture up here, but I think, again, we're also looking at this long-term. We're developing a prospectus, a natural capital prospectus, to encourage maybe a company with ESG requirements to long-term invest in us, to allow us to do these things, because it delivers then us a long-term income stream, and we can get this work done, and it makes it pay, and it makes it sensible. So I think it's really important that we sort of, I guess, understand that. And one final thing I was going to say is, if anyone is engaging with land managers in Scotland and are struggling, if you either contact Scottish Land and Estates or Wildlife Estates, we are in contact with a hell of a lot of them, so we can hopefully help break the ice or whatever, if that helps. So I'll leave you with that. Yeah.
Oh, that's a very kind and generous offer. Thank you, Dee. Thanks very much. Well, I'm just going to give a quick wrap up then. So lots discussed today. If you're going to, I mean, including, I just sort of took away some tips. If you're going to work with farmers, meetings outside, meet them where they are in terms of their identity, be prepared to answer some tough questions, obviously, but lead with the opportunity, because it feels like people are looking for opportunities to present it to them. And then landowners, slightly more cautious, longer term plans, appreciative of partnerships, but ultimately let's try and work sort of a catchment type scale, and lots of opportunities, NFM, woodland, peatland, perhaps emerging water quality, we'll see, and ultimately biodiversity credits will be coming, I'm sure, but still quite a lot of uncertainty, which is of course why we have FIRNS to help us work through some of those things. So thank you so much to all of you. I know we sort of haven't had as much time to talk as we'd like, but the presentations were so helpful, so I wouldn't change a thing. Thank you so much. Thanks to all who attended and to the questions that were here. We do have a webinar coming up on May the 16th. That's going to be on baselining and estimating ecosystem services. And so, of course, feel free to reach out to us or the FIRNS@NatureScot email if you have any questions, but otherwise enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you so much.